Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Powerless Podcast. In this episode, I talked to John Washington, who is a journalist, translator, and the author of a really great book that I just dove into and read during and after this time that I interviewed John for the book called A Case for Open Borders, again by John Washington. We talk about a lot of different things, from the concept of open borders to the punitive measures in a lot of current government structures that endanger people's lives, don't allow basic decency and humanity, and aren't even actually cost effective, and all these different things from a variety of different standpoints, both historically, philosophically, and everything in between. John is an excellent person to learn from on this topic. He's very well read, does a good job in this book of both talking about more historical context and also giving stories of migrants and asylum seekers, both from the U.S.-Mexico border as well as abroad. We get into a really serious but really eye-opening story from a family from Syria as they were trying to seek asylum in a different country, and all the things that entailed there. Really great book. Definitely check it out. I'm going to put several links of where you can find that book in the description here, along with all of John's places that you can find him and find his work. That'll all be in the notes wherever you're listening to this. Really great episode. Again, I can't stress enough how great it was to talk to John. This is a really excellent conversation. Make sure to check in on this, and after you listen to the conversation, read the book, listen to the book, whatever avenue you want to. Again, A Case for Open Borders from John Washington. If you want to get in touch with me, you can always find me at The Powerless Pod on all social media. You can email me at thepowerlesspod@gmail.com if you are a journalist. If you are an author, this is the first time where you kind of have an author of a book on, or a musician, activist, everything in between. Do both music-based episodes and politically-based episodes on the show. Please reach out to me there. Reach out to me through DMs on socials. They're all open DMs. And I would love to hear from people. I'd love to book a variety of different guests. And so just reach out to me there if you have constructive criticism, or if you want to be on the show. If you just want to say what's up, I'm open for all those different things. And the very last thing that I'll always be talking about going forward, when I remember to record intros for the podcast at the very least, is talking about the continued occupation, escalation, violence, ethnic cleansing, and genocide that's currently going on in Gaza. Up to date, according to the Euromed Monitor, there are over 33,000 civilians killed, over 100 journalists killed, hundreds of medical infrastructure, whether it's buildings or ambulances, that have been bombed and destroyed. There's been a lot of horrific stories coming out lately. As escalation happens both in hospitals with violence, people's homes, refugee camps, everything in between, it's getting very dire. But the public pressure is on, and there's a lot of good avenues to go through to apply public pressure. So go to ceasefiretoday.com, go to gazastrong.com, Google search, Palestinian aid or Palestinian protests in your area, all those different avenues. And I'll have a few links for that as well in the notes. Please make sure to figure out what you can do in your busy schedule, whether it's as little as sending an email, donating if you can donate, going to a protest in your area, all those different things. It really does make a difference to apply public pressure to politicians, to those in power, to realize that this is not even in their own self-interest to continue doing. Hold them to the fire and make sure that the escalation of violence and our participation with our tax dollars and sending of military weaponry from a host of different nations, but primarily the United States, ends, so that way this violence can end. So again, go to ceasefiretoday.com, gazastrong.com, Google search if either one of those things happen to not work for you. And I would really appreciate it if everybody took a few minutes out of their days to do that. All right, after that, let's get into the episode. This is a great conversation that I have with John Washington, who is the author of the book, A Case for Open Borders, and he'll be joining us right after this. Okay, I am here for the next episode of the Powerless Podcast with John Washington, who is a journalist, translator, and author, who you've done reporting for a couple of different outlets. I know you have listed, at least on your bios that I can find on social media, for Luminaria, as well as things for The Intercept, and a few different outlets as well. I noticed as I had started getting into this book, you had also written one previously called The Dispossessed, concerning asylum, U.S.-Mexican border, and beyond. So fair to say for this topic, both when it comes to overall concepts of borders and the reality for those having to cross them, you've done a lot of reporting and a lot of digging on all these different things. I appreciate you coming on and doing this with me. It's been an absolutely fantastic experience to start going through this book as someone who believes in the concept of open borders as like an out there philosophy, but it's great to kind of dig into something that both has a lot of historical context, brings up statistics and more objective circumstances, and also real life stories of people that this has affected. So I guess after all my spiel there, how are you doing today?
I'm doing all right, thank you. Trying to stay on top of news that is just kind of fire hosing out of state legislator, Washington, and the border itself. None of it's good, so I'm doing okay.
Doing okay, all things considered, for
All
a
things
very,
considered.
I'm sure, mentally taxing job for
Yeah, yeah,
staying on top of these things, for sure.
yeah.
Well, what I wanted to do to start off today is sort of delve into what got you focused first on the the concepts of policy and also just real world experiences of people when it comes to the concepts of borders at large, and also kind of getting into some of the specific stories that you mentioned in the book, and I've heard you mention in a few other interviews. um, but just as an overarching kind of introduction here, um, you've been a writer for some years. You, as I've said, this is not even the first book you've put out,
Mhm.
A Case for Open Borders. What got you first focused on this realm of policy and this realm of journalism?
Yeah, well, I grew up in an immigrant community. My mother's from Romania, and she migrated. I think maybe better said, she fled Romania when she was a teenager with her family, and so I grew up hearing stories about immigration, about escape, about flight from oppression and persecution, and I was, in my little bubble in like suburban Ohio, and kind of thought that all that was a thing of the past. Like I remember when the Romanian Revolution happened, and it seemed to enter into this new era, and this was post Soviet collapse as well, and like all the stories I had been hearing seemed like from the black and white days. But then, as I started coming of age politically a little bit, I started sort of getting some wind that actually these things were still happening around the world, and happening along the U.S. Mexico border. And after college, I moved out to California, and I actually used this as one of the opening scenes of the book. I was out doing some camping with a pal, and we stumbled across a young migrant, maybe late teens, maybe early 20s, not that much younger than us, but extremely vulnerable. He was in not great shape. We gave him water, some oranges. We're scared for ourselves to help him more. And it really, really sort of shocked me that this was still happening, that someone could be pushed to go through such extremes, and this took years to kind of really sink in, but I kind of started feeling it right away, that the structure of the border and the ideology behind the border had so creeped into my own understanding and way of being, that I hesitated to provide help for him. I mean, I gave him some water and oranges, and we were nice, but the guy needed a ride, and I was scared to do it, and I didn't do it.
Right.
And that really sort of, like I said, so it was like a slow realization that I was like, holy crap, like this is has so influenced how I am as a human being towards other human beings. And I sort of started looking into it more. I was like trying to be a writer, and started doing some volunteer work and became an activist along the border. And that was where I started seeing stuff that didn't line up with the national conversation. And I think people didn't understand who
Hmm.
was coming to the United States, how they were coming, why they were coming. And you start pulling on any of those threads, and it's so complicated, and there's so much context that needs to be given, and there's so much history there if you really want to understand it. And I didn't see anyone really, some people, rather, some people are doing great work there, but not enough of it, and too many people are missing it. And so I felt like I wanted to start pitching in, start really trying to get to the bottom, really exposing what the reality is along the border and why that reality is.
Well, and I think, and this isn't something I don't really necessarily want to delve into specific current events topics too much. I think plenty of people do that on other sort of horse race political things
Yeah.
right now, especially with current legislation. Not to downplay the impact of that, but I think what you just bring up there is an important point that even people that mean well, people even I'm still learning myself the more I've dove into um, the overarching the whys of this, which I think
Hmm.
the book hits on ahead in a very impactful way of just for lack of a better term to use, the Overton window of what is talked about with policy. Um, and implementation of border security and all these different things, and just the not just policy, but the dinner table conversations, for as an example, for people that they have, just the spectrum of how this is talked about for a vast majority of people, regardless of sort of at large political views or who they support in elections and all these different things. It really does miss the mark of what you talk about in this book so much, not just in the United States but internationally. And I just do have to commend anyone that's listening that as we get into this, definitely read this book. It's not so academic that someone like me who's just a layman doesn't understand it, and yet you do give a lot of insight from academics, from political thought, thinkers, both from a historical sense as far back. I think I heard you reference somebody from the early 20th century, as
Hmm.
well as people today, which encapsulates, I think, the understanding of just how far away we are from a rational perspective on immigration and migration and
Hmm.
the border crisis. Is that something that is frustrating for you across sort of, or telling for you, I guess, across different administrations, across different, you were just talking about state electorate,
Hmm.
local governance, federal governance, that you just feel like really gets lost in the conversation, that the real issues and the real solutions, possible solutions, are just not even within eyesight philosophically.
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for that commendation. One of the ways, and this is, I think, going towards an answer to your question here, but one of the ways I think about the work that I do is as a translator. So I also work as a translator. I've translated or co-translated a number of books from Spanish to English, and I do articles as well. And I really like that work. I'm really drawn to it. I think it's a beautiful act. And I kind of have come to think of my writing as well as an act of translation. So you mentioned I, lean hard on some academics and social scientists and theorists and politicians. And I feel like one of the things I do as a journalist and as an author is go into those realms, try to understand what they're saying, and translate it into accessible language. I really wanted this book to be accessible. I really wanted to be sort of a tool. And the reason that we need translation, I mean, we kind of all know why we do from academic language. It's just like too dense and too rarefied, and just like, people stretch to try to make things more complicated than they need to be. But also, history, like going deep into history and sort of recapsulating that, or it's kind of like an act of translation. And then, and this is unfortunate, but listening to the way that politicians speak today about the border, actually, you need to translate that, because what they're saying is so far from the way that people actually speak about things that they see, that it seems like it's another language. And here's an example of that. This is one that happens all the time, is that people say that we have open borders right now. People say that the bill that was proposed by the Senate was an open border bill. And so what does that mean? Because if anyone is down here looking at the border, as I am very frequently, it's not an open border. So what do they mean by that? Oh, okay. So we need to interpret that. We say this is a sort of rhetorical cudgel that they're using to try to smear their political opponents. They're trying to, gear up and, campaign funds right now and sort of get the momentum rolling on that. And so I think we actually really need to do the work to understand what they're saying as well. I mean, it's laden with such absolute bunkum and just complete bullshit that it's like, why do we want to go through
Mhm.
that? But I think it's important to understand actually how the border works. And one of the ways that the border works, and the way that people have been using the border, is by stoking fear, is by just using it as a campaign point. And I think that is really important to emphasize and to understand. Like, okay, that's what's going on here. Like, that's why this new Senate bill, which I thought was abominable, but they got what they asked for. That's why it didn't pass, because the border isn't actually a security threat. Border crossings aren't a security threat. It's a campaign tactic. That's important to understand. Um, Maybe I said I was going to sort of start steering that towards the answer to your question, and I've actually now forgotten what your exact question was. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I lost it a little bit here too,
Yeah,
but I think you
yeah.
did a little bit in the sense of, it kind of goes. What you're talking about is another question I did want to ask you. Maybe we'll end up
Okay, yeah.
answering this in the process here. But you just brought up and again, like I said, I don't want to delve too much into these, sort of like top, current events topics as they are with the policy, because as we know, it's a lot more longstanding than that. Although, like you said, this is a big encapsulation of a huge issue that you point out in the book that a lot of people bring up as sort of dismissive when it comes to political commentary or journalism, which is how much the border is used as political theater, not just in the
Hmm.
United States. You gave great examples for the EU as an example. During continuing Syrian refugee crises,
The
and
UK,
them trying
Brexit.
to find a safe haven.
Yeah,
The UK, we could name off
yeah,
probably
yeah,
just about a majority of the
yeah,
Western, at least the Western nations. I
yeah,
don't know personally as much about the others, but we could probably
yeah.
bring that up as well. Um, uh, but you make a point in the book that I think is such a good point for people to understand when it comes to political theater in that realm of how much it really does impact the people's lives that are being subjected
Hmm.
to this rhetoric for the encapsulation of an election, or trying to fundraise, or whatever sort of electoral conversations are
Hmm.
going on, and just kind of speak to a little bit of some of the different things, and overarching concept there of how impactful political theater is in the. I guess you did a little bit there already,
Hmm.
but if you can speak on that a little more, of how much political theater impacts the policy that affects so many people that are trying to find safe haven or trying to immigrate to another country.
Yeah. Jeez, there's so many examples. Political theater and just the rhetoric that politicians use, this currently fashionable way of looking at people who are migrating, calling them like military age men. We recently had here in southern Arizona a case of this like right wing provocateur calling himself a journalist. James O'Keefe tried to infiltrate some activist spaces here and making absolutely wild and, I mean, fantastical claims about the work that people are doing, the way that people are acting, and it's not true. And it really, I think, is dangerous work. So right now, I mean, people have been doxxed recently. There have been, I can't get too detailed here, but because people are trying to keep things down low to not like see copycat efforts, but workers for
Mhm.
local jurisdictions have been severely threatened. There have been attempted like sabotages and ambushes against vans and buses with migrants on them in the area. The rhetoric and the political theater, it trickles down into actions of uh, wingnuts. people who are scared and are kind of down and out for other and legitimate reasons, and they found a scapegoat that politicians have delivered to them, and that is the other, the figure of the other, the migrant, the newcomer, and they've been lashing out. We saw it in 2019 with Patrick Crusius, who drove 10 hours across Texas to a Walmart in El Paso and opened fire and killed dozens of people. That was his manifesto was, you know, cribbed pretty closely from Greg Abbott, from Donald Trump, from Stephen Miller. Um, People take things that these leading figures say, and they act upon them, and that is incredibly dangerous. So I'm talking about some outlying examples here of people resorting to extreme violence. A not outlying but a very mundane version of extreme violence is the border itself. Right now, I'm 55, 60 miles from the border. This is very much a border town in Tucson, Arizona. People are skirting the wall. They're submitting themselves into the hands of smuggling operations, and they are crossing the desert. Most people are turning themselves in to try to ask for asylum, and it's still has its dangers for sure, but it is not as extreme as trying to walk 3, 4, 5, 7 plus days through the desert, where every year people die. Lots of people die. We don't have exact figures that are impossible to get, but we know that last year this was the deadliest land route of any migration route in the world. There was over 800 people known to have died, and that number could be double that or more. I gave a presentation for the book a couple of weeks ago, and it was a day after a mother and her two children drowned while trying to cross the Rio Grande and get sort of skirt around some buoys that the Texas National Guard had put out there. So this has effects, and incredibly violent ones, every single day. So it is political theater. It is a made-up line that we have invented and fabricated whole cloth and said that this is the terminus of American sovereignty when it's not. And yet the enforcement of this fiction kills people, makes them suffer. I spoke with a woman of a 1-year-old child a few weeks ago who had brain surgery. It seems like he's going to be okay if things go right. It was like sounds like a contradiction in terms of like a minor brain surgery. She is also fleeing violence in a place in Mexico, and she's waiting for, at this point, it's been months to try to ask for asylum with her 1-year-old who needs medical, consistent medical attention. She's stuck waiting at the gate, hoping to be let in. That is also the reality of this political theater. So it does seem like, oh, maybe it's not as consequential. It's just theater. It's just theatrics. It's just rhetoric. It's just campaign tactics. Just calling this invasion doesn't really matter. Saying that they're poisoning the blood, oh, is just a flourish. But no, this is what happens on the ground. This is like the reality of how these policies actually play out and how they affect human beings and people, and it crushes them.
Yeah, I thanks for going over that. I think that perfectly encapsulates. And again, you talk about this at length with a plethora of examples, both again in the United States, similar to what you talked about with uh, with people drowning in the Rio Grande, and also you know uh, completely across the world with other issues involving punitive border measures. And one story that stuck out to me early on as I was taking notes from reading this book is a similar story, but just really encapsulates how this is sort of a worldwide concept that also needs to be looked at. While, as you said, the U.S. Mexico border is the most deadly, is the most
Mm,
draconian in a lot of ways, and the most punitive. A story that I'd like for maybe you to go over for listeners, if you're willing, is the first one that you told in relation to what I brought up earlier, uh, with Syrian refugees going to Turkey, and the freezing temperatures, and this story that you had from this family that you were able to communicate with via I think you said through a translator. Could you because actually I this one's specifically interesting to me because y'all I sometimes talk to musicians on here, and I talked to a German metal band a couple of months ago where they actually work with, and I forget the specific name of the organization. I should have pulled it up, but they work with a non for profit that goes to save, you know, uh, Greek refugees that are, or I mean, refugees trying to go to Greece in different areas that are drowning out in the sea, that get turned away or um, get left out in the open water and all these different things. And the story about this one was not uh, in the sea is a very
Mm,
similar story of just people being completely left destitute and left abandoned with no resources. So
mhm.
do you mind going into that story a little bit if
Sure.
you know which one I'm
Yeah,
referencing?
yeah, I do.
And kind of talk about the concept there as well, and where the fallacy of the border patrol, border control has real life altering consequences for these people.
Yeah. So, just one point of clarification: the U.S.-Mexico border is thought of as the deadliest land route in the world. The
Okay, right,
Mediterranean
correct. Sorry,
migration
thanks for the
corridor,
clarification. Yeah.
yeah, is very likely the most deadly overall, most deadly migration
Hmm.
corridor. Um, it's really hard to know how many people die, how many people have drowned in the Mediterranean, but it's a lot, tens of thousands. So yeah, the story I was working on a story for the Nation about sort of a recap of the response to the Syrian um, war and how countries have taken in or not taken in refugees, and you know, overwhelmingly, the number of refugees have gone to nearby neighboring states, Lebanon and Turkey, and Western countries have claimed to be overwhelmed, have claimed to be, not having the capacity to take in refugees. Um, Europe has taken in, a number, like a few million Syrian refugees. It might be a couple million. I can't remember the exact number right now. Um, that pales in comparison to just Lebanon, which is a tiny country and a tiny, not wealthy country, and is going through a lot. And you know, so it just kind of, I think, numerically is important to point out. The United States too was very nervous about taking in Syrian refugees. I think to date, I think we've taken in less than 30,000 Syrian refugees. There are approaching 7 million Syrians who have been displaced from their country. So we've taken in 30,000. Let's just put those numbers in just have those in the back of our mind as we consider this story. So I was trying to get in touch with people who were currently trying to flee Syria, and through a roundabout way, I finally got in touch with his family, and working with an interpreter, and they had fled a number of different times. They'd been internally displaced from their hometown, Ghouta, and they fled when the regime was bombing that their neighborhood, and then they fled again, and then they realized that there was nowhere else to go but try to leave the country, and that this wasn't going to happen. I think they had 5 children, and the main person I was talking to was the father of the family, Abu Yasin, and they tried to get to Turkey, so they went up to the northwestern border of Syria and Turkey, and they were trying to get across, but they saw that the border was completely closed. There were some people who were, for a fee that they couldn't even come close to affording, were trying to get people to skirt around the walls. And at this point, too, there were rumors, and I think they're probably credible, of actually Turkish border guards shooting at people who were approaching the wall. So they were stuck. They were really stuck. They were living in a makeshift camp, along with hundreds of thousands of other people at this point. It was December, dead of winter. Their youngest child, Iman Leila, was sick, and she froze to death. And there were complications with her sickness. She had a cold or something, and they tried to find help for her. They couldn't, and she froze to death in her father's arms. And this is, I think, just exemplifies so poignantly for me the inhumanity of blocking people from seeking safety. And here, Turkey is most obviously the first to blame. They were the one who, erected the wall there. And I get in the book, I get into some of the history of that exact portion of the border, and it's really not that old. That land actually
Right.
used to that Turkey now holds and pushes people back from used to be Syrian, and before that it was it wasn't exactly nationalized. So that border was drawn
Mhm.
after World War One. That border is now enforced by Turkey, but with the absolute help and complicity of both the EU and the United States. So there was a U.S. diplomat that was actually on the ground, relatively close there, not too long before Iman Leyla froze to death, who was supporting Turkey, and they said that we can't let people come because it would be turn into a wave of people, overwhelming wave of people. So it would have been a struggle, certainly. Like I mean, when you are letting in tens of thousands or maybe even more people through a certain area, there has to be a response, and it's going to be a little bit tricky. But what's the alternative? Well, the alternative we've seen is people being bombed to death by their own government, and people like little children freezing to death because they can't find basic safety. They can't even put a roof over their heads. That is a really dramatic example, but there are thousands and thousands of those everywhere. There are thousands of those along the U.S. Mexico border as well. So, I picked this one to try to understand a little bit of a different international situation, but those stories, except for all the the human details, they repeat themselves throughout the world.
Yeah, and I just always think it's important as I'll start to probably ask you some questions on this overall concept that you portray in the book to kind of give the reality of what current policies enact. And it's not a it's important to note, even from whether it's a more hardline conservative view on this, or a within the, as I said earlier, Overton window liberal response, quote
Mm,
unquote, to borders, is that the it's not a bug in the system, it's the system and the concept itself at play that creates these situations for people. So thank you for going over that. And as you said, it's important to know that this is not an outlier.
right.
It is, the most, it is an extreme example in the sense of, this is probably as you can't think of something much worse, but it's by no means a one-off situation of what's happened to people seeking shelter and seeking a safe haven.
Hmm.
So again, thanks for going over that. What I wanted to do next is, just as this is probably a pretty simple question for you, maybe it's not, but as you said earlier, for the quote unquote, especially American political theater, as both of us live in the United States, we hear a lot about, especially when the conservative Republican Party is the opposition party, about the concept of open borders. And as you said, nothing could be further from the truth from any policy that's been laid out in our lifetimes, for sure. uh, so go ahead and, just as it might be a simple concept to sort of understand philosophically, go ahead and give sort of a concept to listeners, as what you propose in the book, as long-winded or as short-winded as you
Hmm.
want to, uh, for what you mean when you talk about the concept of open borders,
Hmm.
between different nations.
Hmm. Yeah. Great question. And I think one of the motivations behind the book is that I didn't know either, really. I often
Right.
reacted against the status quo and against proposals that made borders even more militarized. But when I was like, "That's bad. I don't like that," and a lot of people I talked to and worked with also recognized, even if they weren't activists, even if they weren't really political, they're like, "That's bad. Like, we don't want more militarized borders. We don't want more wall. We don't want more family separation. Well, what do we want?" And that I think wasn't really articulated, or I wasn't finding it very clearly articulated. I think that there's a number of ways to think about it. I think that we you can get really complicated and sort of even abstruse about the legal mechanisms that you would do to impose or to open up borders. But I think it's kind of simple. Just like people should be able to move. People should be able to go where they want to. In fact,
Hmm.
I can go where I want to right now. I mean, a lot, maybe a lot of your listeners have that same completely unearned privilege by being born as a citizen of the United States. Me, as a white straight guy in the United States, I can go where I want to. I think everyone should have that freedom. I think, in fact, having a world system in which some people have this inherent right and others don't, that's that's not good. What that is I think something like
Right.
global apartheid. People have
Hmm.
different laws for different people. That's this current system. So people should be able to move. I think we can start with that simplicity. In fact, mobility, is a basic feature of our species. We've always moved. Um, so it's actually really important for us to continue to move. And what this can look like politically or in real time is maybe something like the way that we divide up and organize different jurisdictions in the United States. So I currently am in Arizona. I've lived in a number of other states throughout my life. I had to re-register to vote, register with the DMV, start paying local taxes, property taxes, sign up for all the bills and things like that I have to pay at the end of every month. All of that, it wasn't seamless. It wasn't impossible. The, the government, the people in power knew where I was, and they knew that I would be, well, at least obliged to like pay into the pot where I was so I could take out the benefits. And I think something like that would work. I also, when I did move from state to state, I crossed, you know, physical or political boundaries. I moved to places with very different cultures, cuisines, even languages.
Hmm.
And that is similar, I think, except for one big difference, how moving from country to country is. And then we look at like the EU. There too, you can move from France to Spain. You never have to flash a passport. To actually to move
Right.
permanently, it takes some bureaucratic hoop jumping, but it's not impossible. In fact, it's not prohibited. There are other places like that in the world as well. There's 4 countries have an agreement in Central America, the Scandinavian countries, in between Australia and New Zealand. I could go on and on. There's a number of different these free migration zones and free passport zones, and
Hmm.
migration is a little bit more complicated, but it's not the presumption isn't to prohibit it. The presumption is to let people figure it out and do what they need to do. So I think it's kind of simple. It works, and there are a number of sort of quick reactions to that a lot. And I think that we have evidence to say that those reactions and those fears of what that might look like um, may be valid for the person, but they won't be borne out in reality. Right now, how many years have we seen this, open free passport zone in Europe? And France is still as French as it was 20 years ago.
Right.
Germany is still as German as it was a long time ago. Um, and Virginia is still as Virginia as it was 20 years ago or 100 years ago. And people from California, from Puerto Rico, from Florida, from these far-flung, completely different places have been able to move to Virginia, and it's still Virginia, and it still has its own thing, kind of. I don't know. I don't know Virginia that well, but as an example. So I think that those fears aren't really we wouldn't lose a cultural diversity. Cultures are constantly changing, and they're changing in ways that they always have. They've never been static. Migration does influence it, but it's not, I think, at this point, even by far the prime mover. I think internet internet culture, the globalization that came with that, and like the rise of just globalism itself, has really changed cultures in pretty profound ways. the petering of like organized religion, I think, has changed cultures in broad ways, and then just the constant shifting of them that has always happened has changed them, but it's not primarily because of migration. One other quick reaction and sort of like counter argument I think it's important to dispel is that places would be overwhelmed, and we also have evidence to show that likely wouldn't be the case. Um, Most people, when they do move, they don't move far. Here's one stat that I wish I could share, and I wish that could put up on a postcard and share with every politician in DC right now, is that 90% of all African refugees are in Africa at this moment. They've fled their countries to other countries in
Right.
Africa. The same with Venezuelans. By overwhelmingly, the most Venezuelans are in South America right now. They've had to flee their country, but they didn't flee far because they want to stay close to home, because they know that culture. They know they're close. They might have family members that are nearby. They might hope to go back. Um, People like where they live, except when they are forced, when they're unable to live there. And one of the really important corollaries to opening borders is to making sure that the systems that are in place right now, neocolonialism, extractive industries, exploitative industries, these drivers of rising climate change, we need to address those as well. And if we only open the borders, we're not going to fix the inequality, incredible gaps of inequality that are throughout the world that are driving people to flee, the persecution that happens, the extractive industries that despoil home countries. We have to address those too. And if we do that, then we also enhance or bolster the right to stay. And I think most people actually want to stay, and they will if we also address these underlying causes that are pushing people.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing that I've always personally felt about this, which goes back to the whys that you go into in the book, right? That it's when you're talking about the border, you're talking about a concept like open borders, or you're talking about, very failed draconian measures that are currently in place right now. Um, those are a piece of the puzzle, right? And I think that's an important thing to point out. And I really appreciate that you pointed that out. That having the concept of people being able to migrate, people being able to move, as you pointed out, a lot of us really take that for granted. I'm talking about that myself in my own life, and never is there a concept of like, well, we'll be allowed to. It's like, I don't know, can you afford it? Can you
Yeah,
deal? Can you figure out the right paperwork, right,
yeah,
to go where you need to go? It's a
yeah,
very different sort of frustration.
yeah,
That's shit, which is fine and within the realm of normalcy, right? And you don't really think about how just it's sort of, this might sound a little dramatic, but I think you would probably agree with it, that it comes down to almost, and this is where sort of, xenophobic intents come out to play in these situations of birthright almost, right?
hmm
Like it almost comes off as like, you know, you are better because you're more human than someone from somewhere else because you happen to be born in Illinois instead of Ecuador, right? And that's such a profound point, along with looking at the reason of, if you as someone that has sort of normal, quote unquote normal American beliefs on the border, or more hardline rights on the border, is thinking about, well, if you think that there's a lot of people, too many people coming here, why is that happening? It's
yeah,
not because people suddenly want, as you said, want to leave their culture, their family, where they grow up, where they might have pride in, because they feel like it. It's because of all these things you just laid out, in pretty clear fashion, that we can all see through science, through statistics, and everything in between. So it's just an important thing for people to very easily deconstruct,
hmm
but it's just not what's talked about again in the zeitgeist of what most people consume in their day to day
yeah.
readings or conversations, right?
I was doing a talk, yeah, a couple weeks ago, and I was getting some grief from someone who was saying, "Well, yeah, we should welcome him in, but it costs our local jurisdictions a lot of money." And they were giving me an example. Actually, it was to keep harping on that state for some reason. And there was like 30 Haitians who had made their way to Virginia somehow, and um, they were being put up in a hotel for like I don't know for how long, for a few days, for a week or so. The money actually was coming from FEMA, but it was then filtering down and being allocated through the local county. And to like see, look, it does kind of tax the local economy a little bit. And it's like, okay, a couple things here, like putting up 30 Haitians for a week. I mean, come on, you can stomach that. And second is like, do you want to talk to me about the current reality, the last century of U.S. meddling in Haiti? Like, let's get into it because, my God, like, I think there may not be another country in the hemisphere that has been so racked by foreign intervention, that is currently basically under foreign occupation through this UN backed whatever, that Kenyan troops currently are being sent to Haiti to start policing it. Like the US has invaded 5, 6 times, like has been directly involved in multiple coups. Like, like we could have an entire series on U.S. history of meddling in Haiti, and now there's some Haitians are fleeing the country, and we're like, nah, we can't handle it. Like that is like the height of hypocrisy to me, and the height of just moral blindness, that we can't understand why people are leaving, and we can't understand our role in why people are leaving their homes, and then we still try to deny them. It's just it's really frustrating. I think the historical blindness is really at fault here. We don't really see beyond our borders in the United States very much. Anything that happens is something that you know, maybe only concerns us if it's a direct threat. And anything that we do seems to be just like, yeah, it should be fine, and like whatever, it doesn't really matter. But it has consequences, and those are the consequences of people needing to flee and actually making it to our shores.
Yeah, the concept of blowback just doesn't really seem to be in the in the realm of conversation whatsoever. But it's just like, I think it reminds me of, and I think and then I'll end it with just a few things I'd want you to maybe
Yeah,
summarize from the book, or what you want people to get from the book. I appreciate your time. But it reminds me of, in I think it was 2020 or 2021, after about 12, over a decade of us arming and supporting what happened in Yemen over the past decade, with uh, Saudi Arabia's onslaught there, and a lot of different sanctionings of food and medicine and gas and all these different things. And then you'd see articles finally in like 2020 that was like, it's crazy this is happening there. What a wild, terrible thing. That's like, it all happens in a vacuum, right? It's kind of like all the different, it's like if there's um a big portion of migrants that say come from Honduras or something, and no one talks about the coups and the displacement and the backing of far right, um, death squads, for lack of a better term,
and
in
drug
some instances,
smugglers,
and all
and
these
yeah,
different coups,
yeah,
and drug smugglers,
yeah,
and all these different things. And it's like, none of that happens in a vacuum. Even if you're only thinking of your own self-interest, you should be for what you talk about in this book, because it's literally,
yeah,
it's less, it's less money being spent when you're in the sense of money being spent on things that are ruining other people's lives, that then need to leave their homes to come somewhere else, right? Along with the U.S. Border Patrol, I think, being the highest funded law enforcement in the country, right? All these different things, and it's
yeah,
like, you don't have to be someone that's gone into all these different things. You have at great length, and in great fashion, to break it down a little bit, step back, pull back a veil, and then realize that the this concept you're talking about is not the crazy concept. It's maybe the concept that's become way out of the norm for everyday people, but it's certainly what I view as, at least, the logical one, you
hmm
know?
the logical one.
Yep.
We've mentioned sort of the importance of looking into history. There was no significant portion of any wall along the U.S. Mexico border as recently as 1990. Um, so the status quo is very, very recent. For the first 100 years of
Hmm.
the existence of the United States, there was zero federal immigration policy. Zero. We have had much different policies and realities along the border, and we've forgotten. So yeah, this is not wild to think that we could take down the wall, because we had zero wall for like 95% of this country's history or something like that.
Yeah, great point. It also just kind of shows how short the memory is for for what gets talked about,
Yeah.
both from politicians and a lot of people in sort of the larger media apparatus, right? So great point. Thanks for bringing that up. We've touched on a lot of what I was going to ask about at the end here. I know at the it's towards the end of the book you kind of give some summary points, because you do talk explicitly in the book that you're not giving a step by step directive on how we get to this point. I think we know that's a very complicated question that would take another probably 3 books to lay out in in great detail.
I'll work on
Um,
it.
uh, uh, but uh, but it later on in the book you talk about some sort of summarizations of what can be done, and also just kind of dispelling some of the myths surrounding the concept of open borders. And while we've touched on some of these things, what are you know a few that you point out in the book? I don't want you to give the whole book away because I want people to read it, but what are some of the points that you can give here to dispel certain misnomers, or really bring home that this concept is worth um, bringing into the fold, as opposed to what our current border policies, both in this country and at large, are.
Hmm. Um, well, I guess if I'm hearing the question right, what folks can do, kind of. I think that one thing
Yeah,
folks
yeah,
can do is inform themselves, because there really is a lot of falsity and misinformation, deliberate misinformation about the border, which we've touched on. I think it's really critical to actually get what's going on. And here you have to kind of pick your news outlets that you go to, or get there yourself. And we could do a lot of chatter about the downfall and the problems with the media industry right now, but there are still folks doing good work. There are still people who are writing books and being on the front lines and reporting. And I think really listening and supporting those people, it sounds so self-serving, but I think it's actually truly important. Is one big step. Let's just be clear about what's going on, for starters, and question people who make wild claims. I think that's really important. There's a lot of ways that, like, almost anywhere you are in the country, I'm sure there are nearby migrant aid organizations that need help, and that need support, and that are under threat, and volunteering, donating. Even, it sounds trite, but it's true. Is people have operational budgets and they need to have funds to work. Um, there are new ways that, like, there are, like, sort of new projects that are being launched to try to help sponsoring migrants and asylum seekers. You can start looking into that. There's the Welcome Corps. It's flawed, but I think it is a step in the right direction. And then, I don't know. I mean, like, thinking of it from like a big picture, like, electoral stance. It's so depressing looking into the near future, like what's going to happen in November. We're recording this on a day after news is breaking that Biden is considering executive action to further limit asylum, which goes exactly against much of his campaign promises, and even his early chatter as in office. I don't have much hope, but I think that the alternative really will be even worse. But holding elected officials to account and being like, no, we're not going to cave. And I think here's like a broader answer here, which is not like as clearly actionable, but something we were sort of touching on before is there. It just hasn't been a clear vision on the left of what we want. It's just been reactionary. It's just been defensive. And I think we need to articulate and defend that vision. If you're only going to be up in arms about the worst policies coming out of Trump and now coming out of Biden, or before coming out of Obama, what do we stand on? I think the only ground we're standing on there is a very, very slippery slope. It's like, well, we don't want babies ripped out of parents' arms, but maybe a lesser version of that.
Yeah.
Or like, we don't want ICE doing roving raids and knocking on, people's houses and taking their families, ripping their families apart. But maybe we want only some of that. Like, what exactly do you want? Because just softening the worst that we've seen and we're seeing right now isn't an actual policy standpoint. And I think we need one. And I think people need to clarify it and then actually push towards it. And that's been lacking.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and then I'll just have you plug here where people can find your work and find your book and all that good stuff. But I think that last point is such another one to just really rail home that I distinctly remember when Biden was first elected as an example, and people were talking about the success of no longer separating families when they're put in detention centers. And it's like, I don't know that in any rational world, this is a championing thing. If you do that and that's your policy and you believe in that, we can talk about how bad that is, but to champion that is certainly disheartening. But as you said, holding, I think, pressure, I've always been someone that believes, collective action, public pressure, no matter what policy you believe in, if it's to the betterment of society, that's where you start. You don't start by championing these people that have clearly shown that they're not up to their word, and even their word is less than should be desired. So again, John, thanks so much for going over this with me. I really appreciate your time. Really appreciate the work that you've put out. A Case for Open Borders came out on February 6th. I know you've done that. You've done a lot of other work. So just kind of plug where people can find that book, where people can find your work, and we'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Great talking to you. I want to mention on the last point. Yeah. So being against ripping apart families, like, is that like a champion policy point? Like, not really. And they've still ripped apart families. Like, I covered family separation under the Biden administration. We did a big piece for the Texas Observer about that. Anyways, need to mention that. Thank you. It's been great talking to you. Y'all can find me on Twitter. I write for Arizona Luminaria, a local outlet here, but we do cover a lot of these big issues. And the book, The Case for Open Borders, it's available at your local bookstore, which is where I hope people go and grab it, or your local library. Also on all the major online retailers, Amazon and Bookshop, or direct from Haymarket, which is the publisher.
Awesome. So again, thanks so much for doing this, and I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you.
The number of people coming here illegally was down by over 35%. We arrested hundreds of people, and it's essential that we stop people coming here because it's simply not fair. Now climb is an exercise. Build a wall and build more cages, killing raiders who lies. The vision psychopaths in suits. Smile for the cameras as we not untie your nose. To the nails in your car.